Hey guys, I'm Leandro Maldonado, and in today's video we're going to talk about lazy loading components in Angular. Before going into the details of how to implement lazy loading components with Angular, there is a concept that we must understand first. In Angular, there are two main ways to dynamically render a component. We can either do it from the template or we can do it in the TypeScript code. Let's start by understanding how ngComponentOutlet works. For this, I have created a component with two elements, a button and an ngContainer. When we click on the button, we will load a component, and in the ngContainer, thanks to the ngComponentOutlet directive, we will render that component. Let's look at how to implement it from the TypeScript side. As you can see here, I'm using a standalone component, that's why I need to add ngComponentOutlet to my components imports. I also have one property, Widget component. This is where we will store the component that we want to render dynamically. In order to do that, we will be using calendar widget component. This is a simple component that will render the current month. And that is all we need to make the ngComponentOutlet work. Now it's time to test it. So if I click on the load calendar widget, we can see that ngComponentOutlet is rendering the calendar widget component. Now we can make this more interesting, and let's say we add a random variable here. If random is greater than 0.5, I want my widget component to be calendar widget component. Else, we also have a weather widget component available. Let's make sure to adjust the type here. And now with this change, when we click on the button, sometimes it's going to render the calendar widget and sometimes it's going to render the weather widget component. Let's see how that works. If we click on this button, it's rendering the weather widget component and also rendering the calendar widget component. Now that we know how to render components dynamically with the help of ngComponentOutlet, let's start talking about lazy loading components. For this, let's open the DevTools and let's go to the Network tab. Here, when I reload the page, we will notice that there is a file that its size is 3 megabytes. That is too big for the current project complexity. So let's try to see why this file is so big. It looks like it's related to the calendar widget component, which is a component that we are not even rendering the first time, but it is still part of the compilation. But why do we have the calendar widget component as part of the bundle when on the first load of the page we don't even display the calendar widget component? The reason behind it is just because we are using directly the calendar widget component here when we make this assignment. And this is having an impact on the loading times of our application, because even though we are not displaying the calendar widget component, we still have to download the 3 megabytes. In order to avoid the calendar widget component being part of the initial bundle that loads the application, we'll need to make some adjustments and make sure that we lazy load this component. For this, we'll add an import pointing to the path of our component, and then we'll need to access the calendar widget component itself. Since this is a promise, we can await on it, and we also need the async keyword Now we can do the same with the weather widget component. Let's apply some formatting. And now that it looks good, let's go to the browser. Here, let's reload the application. And as we can see here, we no longer have a file that is 3 megabytes in size. Let's clear the network log and let's start trying to load our widgets. If I click on the button, I will get the weather widget, and I can see here that there was a request. This chunk here includes all the code needed for the weather widget to work. Let's see what happens if I click on this again. We get the calendar widget, and as we can see here, now the 3 megabytes are not part of the main bundle when we load the application, but are being lazy loaded when we actually need the calendar widget component. Now, it is time to understand how the ViewContainerRef works. As you can see in the template, we only have one button that will load the calendar widget. Here, in order to load the calendar widget component, we will just need to store the calendar widget component in a variable and then call the ViewContainerRef create component, passing that component as a parameter. If we go to the application, when we click on the load calendar widget button, we will see that the calendar widget gets rendered correctly. Now let's update the code so it also lazy loads the component instead of having it as part of the initial bundle. For this, I will still have a variable here, but as we learned before, we need to import the component. For this to work, we need to await on the import, also add the async keyword. Now, when we go to our application and go to the network tab, let's see what is the behavior here. I'll reload the application. The size of the file looks right. I will try to load the calendar widget. It correctly displays the calendar widget, and as we can see, there was a network request for the chunk that corresponds to the calendar widget code. So it is working as expected. With everything that we have learned so far, now it's time to look at a more advanced example. Here, we have 4 widgets available to add to a dashboard. Each of these widgets is set up for lazy loading. Why? Because we cannot predict in advance which components a user might need. Loading all of them right away in the initial app bundle doesn't really make sense, and it just slows down the initial loading time. So we use lazy loading to bring in these components only when the user actually needs them, keeping our app's performance smooth. Let's take a look at the code from this example. On the template side, here we iterate over the available widgets of our application to display the widgets that the user can add to their dashboards. On this section here, we iterate over the saved widgets for the user, so we display the widgets in the dashboard. The widget host component itself has 3 methods that are the most important ones: the add widget, where we look for the selected widget ID in a list. This list contains the ID, the name, and a method to lazy load the component. Once we find that widget in the list, we lazy load the component and we update our saved widget signal with the new component. Widget selected is just to update the selected widget ID, and remove widget, which takes care of removing elements from the save widget signal based on the index. There you have it, a deep dive into dynamic component rendering and lazy loading components in Angular. Give these techniques a try in your own projects. Remember, the real learning happens when you dive in and experiment. If you found this video useful, please give it a thumbs up. And for more coding tips, remember to subscribe to Viva the Code. Happy coding and see you in the next video.